Appreciate that. Like Doug said, we were out of country for the last 9 days or so. Got back Tuesday morning about 1:30, 2 o'clock. So some of us have been taking an opportunity to catch up, but just to throw a couple of things out there that he didn't mention about this orphanage, which is called God's Littlest Angels. They're actually a creche, which means they adopt out. They have a 100% adoptable rate, so any child that has come in that is adoptable has been adopted out, with the exception of those who are currently there waiting to be matched. And for some of you who are educators, by the time the child arrives, wherever country they're going, United States, Canada, or France, are typically the three, they're educated within 6 months of grade level. So, I mean, this like computer lab, the works, this place is phenomenal. And we, like Doug said, we get to do everything from playing with babies and beating Haitian kids at basketball to construction work and everything in between. So I would really encourage you to talk to one of the team members and just figure out, hey, is this something I would really like to do? Because it really will change your life. And maybe you'll be able to be the hands and feet of Jesus to somebody who may never see the love of Jesus otherwise. So, I was out of town last Sunday, and I'm kind of bummed because I hear Sunday's message was super interesting. How to have great sex. I'm like, man, I can't believe I missed that. But I also feel pretty good about saying that I bet this week's homework percentage completion is the highest it has been of the series. I'm feeling pretty confident in that. So if you're like, what in the world, what am I missing? Go back and watch last week's message. When you get to the homework, guys, you'll be like, thank you. No need to email. Just go ahead and go do the homework. Really what we talked about was the honeymoon night, right? We had the wedding, we had the honeymoon night, and things were awesome. Things were great. And if you have been married, there's this idea, or people talk about the honeymoon phase. Now, for some people, the honeymoon phase lasts like 3 days. Like, you don't even get off your honeymoon before the honeymoon phase is over. For others, it might last 6 months or a year, but inevitably, life happens. And what you realize, or what you may learn, is that the emotional high and the passion, that's definitely not enough to carry you the next 40, 50, till death do us part, right? It just things start to get a little different, maybe slowly, maybe quickly, just depending upon, and I think it's because we're going to see something that Solomon and his bride, they encounter pretty quickly here in chapter 5, verses 2 through 8. They realize real life has quickly worn the luster off of the honeymoon. Things aren't vacation and cruises and all-you-can-eat buffets and whatever you did for honeymoon. When you get back, you realize that relationships face challenges. That all of a sudden, living with a different person, it's much more difficult than you anticipated. And I think we can boil all those challenges down to one word, and that's conflict. Conflict happens. It's a reality. I think you could even trace conflict back to a single cause, maybe, and that's communication. Right? Because ultimately, in all conflict, there may be a root issue, but the way we communicate or don't communicate about it, that usually is what causes the big problems. That's usually where we see issues crop up, if you will. See, I think that conflict and communication are inversely related to one another. The better and more often you communicate, the lower your conflict will go. However, as you begin to communicate even just poorly, your conflict, that frequency is going to rise. And so I think it's important to understand that conflict and communication are a reality that we need to address as far as relationships. Now, this morning we're going to talk in the context of marriage. But if you're not married, maybe you're 12 and never even thought of having a girlfriend, or I don't know. These principles we're going to talk about how to handle conflict and how to communicate, they're applicable across the board. If you can learn to practice them now, it will make your marriage, it'll set it up for that much more success. But first, I want to spend just a minute or two reading where we see Solomon and his new wife really first experience this. So Song of Songs, chapter 5, starting in verse 2. It says, I slept, but my heart was awake. So the bride, she's talking here. She says, a sound, my beloved is knocking. Open to me, my sister, my love, my dove, my perfect one. For my head is wet with dew, and my locks with drops of the night. But I had put off my garment, how could I put it on? I had bathed my feet, how could I soil them? My beloved put his hand to the latch, and my heart was thrilled within me. And I arose to open to my beloved, and my hands dripped with myrrh, my fingers with liquid myrrh on the handles of the bolt. I opened to my beloved, but my beloved had turned and gone. My soul has failed me. When he spoke, I sought him, but found him not. I called him, but he gave no answer. The watchmen found me as they went about in the city. They beat me and they bruised me, and they took away my veil, those watchmen of the walls. I adjure you, O daughters of Jerusalem, if you find my beloved, that you tell him, I am sick with love. There's a lot happening in these few verses. It's expressed poetically, but what we see is Solomon shows up late. His wife's already in the bed. That's why it's talking about there's dew in my hair. It's really late. And he's forgot his keys, so he's knocking on the door. Now, inevitably, what has happened is that Solomon has allowed the immense pressures of being king to win out, right? He has allowed the weight and the urgency of his work to take priority over his wife. That's what we see. That's the conflict we see here. Now, guys, we can relate because for a lot of us, we find our value and even some of us, our identity in our work. Now, think about it. Anytime you meet a guy, first thing you say is, hey, you introduce yourself, you get names. The second question you ask is what? So what do you do for a living? Like, that's the second question we want to know because we find our worth and our value in that. And so Solomon probably is struggling with that as well. Now, our tendency would be to stop and say, okay, so Solomon is to blame here. He's the reason that this conflict is going on, right? You know it's not going to be a good night. They just got back from the honeymoon. He didn't show up home. He might get to sleep on the couch. And so we're saying, well, Solomon, you messed up. And that's true. But when I was a teenager, my mom used to say to me all the time, it takes two people to argue. It takes two people to cause a problem. Now, she guesstimates, she probably said it 25, 30 times. I guesstimate she said it 25, 30 times a day. Because what we need to realize is in any conflict, in any argument, both parties have responsibility. Both parties have to own some of that, right? So what did his wife do here? What'd she say? Well, I've already taken a shower and I'm in bed, so I can't possibly get dressed again and let you in the door, right? She's going to punish him for not prioritizing her, right? She has responded poorly to Solomon's screw up. So we've got responsibility on both sides here. And that's one of the key things about conflict and communication. We have to learn to recognize that both of us have to own some of that responsibility. And so we see this and we recognize, hey, okay, both these, they have some fault here, but how did they get to this point? On the surface, it's like, well, he did this and she did that. But I think there are some things that they've done, or rather failed to do, for one another that have created sort of a climate where conflict is already brewing. And so that's going to bring us to our first point this morning, and that's fueling conflict. Now, what I want to talk about is going to be very list-based today. I mean, we're going to have a lot of lists, so I'm going to move quickly, so try to stay with me. But I want to look at 4 principles I feel like each spouse neglects that has created like a culture that lends itself towards conflict. So we're going to start with the guys this morning, and we're going to look at some things I think Solomon has done that he has fallen short. And the first of those principles that Solomon neglects is this precept of time. Now, men and women, I think Pastor Brandon talked about this a few weeks ago, view time very differently. Men are all about quality of time. I'm like 15 minutes. You're going to get all of me for this 15 minutes. And I'll be honest, most of us, we're not very good at that even anymore because we got the cell phone out or the ball game on or something. But that's the way we view time, quality. Whereas women, more so, they view it in a quantity. For them, love time is like currency, and they need you to spend it regularly. So Solomon's wife, as probably many of our own, if they're honest, they feel a little bit left out because he chose to spend all of his time for that day at work as opposed to at home. Right? When 6 o'clock rolled around, he said, I got this one more thing I've got to get done. Instead of saying, it's time for me to go home and spend time with my family, with my wife. You know, and I don't want you guys to sound like I'm beating you up or anything because I'm really not speaking, especially on this point, from a position of success. You know, I think it might have even been this week, Julie said to me, just in offhanded conversation, she said, this is the first time in almost 10 years, because we've been together right at 10 years that I've been in ministry. She said that I feel like I've had to compete with ministry for your attention. Right? See, I'm speaking from a place of failure. I'm not spending my time wisely enough on my wife. But the thing is, before you can fix a problem, you have to recognize that there is one. Solomon has failed to spend adequate time with his wife. Make sure your spouse is a priority, not an afterthought. And that brings us to our second standard, if you will, that I feel like Solomon is neglecting. And it's very closely related to time, and that's talk. Guys, I know when your spouse starts talking and they don't breathe and they just keep going like this and you're not sure what's going on and they left you a long time ago, you're like, oh my goodness. But here's the thing. Women process emotions and deal with stress by talking about it. And it's your role to help them carry those burdens. We were at a marriage conference, I think it's probably been about a year ago now, and they were talking about just how to really love your wife, and the guy was talking about, you know, your wife has talked for 30 minutes about things, and he said, you really want to know how to move things along? And the speaker says, just 3 words, tell me more. Now, for guys, we're like, what are you doing to us, right? She's already talked for 30 minutes. But women just that's how they process. They need us to listen. So something I have learned, don't offer solutions until they ask for one, right? Because that's what we do as guys. We fix it, right? Our statements around here are, you might not like my solution, but it'll work. And they're not interested sometimes in a solution. I would be willing to bet this week at some point, your wife said to you, are you even listening to me? Because they started talking and we had 3 solutions before they got through the first sentence. But they're not interested. They don't need a solution. Learn to listen. Just focus. Respond back. That's a great way to listen. The third is tenderness. Now, I know this is not a compliment for any guy, right? Like if I looked at Darren and said, Darren, you're a tender guy. Like that's not a compliment. Nobody wants to be, hey, my list of characteristics, tender's at the top. It's just not. But that's exactly the thing that our wife needs from us. They need compassion. They need sympathy. They need empathy. Because what that does is it expresses love to their spirit. It lets them know that they're valuable, that they're cared for. When we don't treat our wives that way, they feel neglected. They feel unloved. You want to create an atmosphere of conflict? Constantly through your actions tell your wife you don't love her. I promise the smallest thing is going to blow up very quickly. And then finally, and most guys are going to argue with me on this, but I feel like many of us are failing at the touch principle. You guys are like, I touched this week. It was the homework. Yeah, you did. But what I'm talking about is non-sexual affectionate touch. At the risk of being maybe too harsh, I think many husbands we have turned our wives into marital prostitutes. We'll exchange affectionate touch and love for sex. That is literally the definition of prostitution. I will give you one good in favor for sex. I know that that's painful to hear. But we have to learn to kiss our wives on the cheek or put our arm around them or hold hands with no ulterior motive. I can imagine that if I was a woman and I felt unloved and treated as a prostitute, then I'm not real happy. And so anytime something maybe even small happens, we're going to have a big problem. And so we have to learn to communicate an atmosphere of love to our spouse. We can't just simply touch in exchange for sex. We can't refuse to be sympathetic and to listen and offer tender responses and spend time. And yet we're guilty of all of those. So first part of your homework, rate yourself 1 through 10, guys. Then compare with your spouse's number. Don't argue over it, but figure out a way you can work together to maybe line those numbers up a little bit closer. All right, so let's move on to our women here. Women, when you fail to do these 4 things, men are going to retreat from the relationship. See, guys aren't overly emotional, but we learn that very early on. And so what we quickly figure out is if something causes us pain, we're just not going to do it again. So if we reach out in one of these ways and it doesn't work out well, we're like, well, okay, I'm done with that. Right? Guys typically are slow learners, but not when it comes to pain. So the first thing that you need to avoid failing at is you need to be your husband's cheerleader. Whether you know it or not, your husband thrives on your approval and your praise, both to him and about him to other people. You are one of the most important opinions in his life, bar none. You know, every time Brandon's either out of town or he gives me the opportunity to speak, a lot of people will come up to me and say, hey, I like this about your message, or I thought that was a good message, or, and I appreciate those compliments. It makes me feel good. But nothing makes me feel better than when I go home on Sunday afternoon and Julia says, that's the best message I've ever heard you preach. Nothing. Because her opinion matters that much to me. Now, don't get it twisted. She'll tell me too, that's the worst message I've ever heard you preach. So she's honest. But it matters. That approval matters. And that's going to directly link us into our next thing, which is be your husband's champion. For some reason, our culture has decided it's okay to just constantly bash men. And unfortunately, I think wives fall prey to that far too often. Talking about whether husbands don't measure up or what they don't do or what you would rather. All of these things. And what you do is because we put our approval in your hands a lot of times, you create self-fulfilling prophecy. If my wife was to say I'm worthless and lazy and no good, well, then why should I try? Because that's the opinion of the person that matters most to me. So I'm going to just settle for worthless and lazy and no good. So I would challenge you, if maybe you feel like your husband's that way, maybe you should reflect on what you've said about him to other people, because you may be creating some of that. I admitted last time I preached that the newborn phase isn't really my thing. So if you're new, I have a 9-month-old, so we're not far out of the newborn phase. And she wasn't very old, and Julie, she does wedding photography on the side, so she had a wedding that night. So I had Kate at bath time and bedtime, and little babies cry a lot. And that frustrates me because I'm like, you're sleepy, so you're crying because you're sleepy, but you're making yourself sleepier because you're crying. It's like, stop. See, I get like that. And so this went on for about 30 minutes, and I was like, okay, I can't take this. So I just laid her in her crib, and I walked in the living room. And I text my wife, who's trying to take wedding pictures, so not the most brilliant thing in the world. And I was just like, I'm about to go crazy. I don't know what to do. And her response back was, you're a great father, you can do this. Now, in that moment, I was not a great dad. But I went back in that room and I put Kate to sleep because my wife said I was. And that's who I was going to be. I was going to be the person that I was in her eyes. I had Kate alone last night, And she went to sleep, and I went to sleep, and it was fantastic. It was a beautiful thing. So, just an example, be your husband's champion. Reinforce them, encourage them, respect him. It'll make a world of difference. Third, be your husband's companion. Most guys, at least in my experience, don't have any good friends. We've got buddies, we've got acquaintances, people you work with or you watch the game with, but most guys don't have anybody they can just be open and honest and intimate and real with. Part of it's because every other guy is afraid of his emotions as well. But every guy needs that. And you're perfectly suited for that. You're naturally emotional. You're there all the time. You committed to forever, for better or for worse. You committed to help carry one another's burdens. Be a friend. I know people who are married who are not friends. I don't know how they do it. They don't even like to really spend time with one another. Learn to like to spend time with one another. It'll change everything about your marriage. And then finally, be his complement. This is what you were designed for. Genesis tells us that man was alone and God said, this is not good. So he made woman to come alongside him, to work alongside him, to do life alongside of him. Be his complement. Help him grow. That doesn't mean nag him to death. Help him grow. Come alongside and work alongside him to grow and to build a future and do all of those things, because ultimately that's what you were divinely designed by God to do. Right? God describes you as a help. I will make for him a helper. It's literally the title of what you were created to be. So now you get to do the same thing. Wives, you do 1 through 10. Guys, you compare and be honest with each other. I feel like if you began to work on these 4 principles, each of you respectively, what you're going to do is you're going to create an atmosphere where conflicts may happen less often, but when they do, they're not such a big deal. And that would ultimately be the goal, right? Because anybody who's ever been married 37 seconds will tell you conflict's inevitable. You're going to argue over something, probably something stupid, but you're going to argue over it. So what we really need to do is, while we work on these, we need to learn about fighting fair. And that's going to be your second point this morning. Again, this is going to be another set of lists. But we need some guidelines. Because I feel like so many of us, when we start getting into conflicts, we throw out all decency for some reason. Like we forget that we're humans and they're humans and we just become jerks. So I'm going to give us 10 guidelines to go by for when conflicts arise. And I'm going to move through these pretty quickly. The first of those, confront your problems. I can't tell you how many people we discuss and we talk with that they bring up something and then you find out it happened like 4 weeks ago. I'm naturally confrontational, okay? It's just who I am. It comes off as abrasive to some people, so if I have offended you, I'm sorry for that in my confrontation nature. But I'd rather just, let's have it out, be done, figure out a solution, and move on. I recognize most people are not that way. Julie is not that way. If something goes wrong, she'd rather go get in the shower and just leave me to think about it on my own. She goes the opposite way. But here's the thing. When we don't confront our problems, little things fester into big things quickly. Just deal with them and move on. The second thing, and this might go a little more for guys than for girls, but listen. I think out loud. So I have a tendency to interrupt people. They'll be talking and I'll have an idea and I just say it. I don't intend to be rude, but that's rude. And it's worse when you're having an argument. So stop interrupting your spouse. Let them say what they need to say. You can then say what you need to say. And please, stop forming your argument while they're still talking. Right? Every single person in here does that. They're talking and you're like making mental notes of everything they've said so you can have your rebuttal ready. Well, this and this and stop. Just listen. And when they say things that you don't understand, ask them to clarify. Say, I'm sorry, can you clarify that? Or I didn't understand that. Or did you mean when you said? Because what that does is it eliminates misunderstandings. I mean, there have been times where Julie and I have been fighting for like 10 minutes, and I'm like, why are we even fighting? Because like, I thought you meant this, but you meant that. Save yourself a lot of grief and headache. Number 3, limit the discussion. We're talking about today. We're talking about what just happened. We don't need to talk about what happened last week or 3 years ago or 10 years ago or, limit it. We're talking about today. Let everything else go. When we were little, my sister and I, we would get in trouble, and our first response was, well, but Aaron is, and my mom said, we're not talking about Aaron, we're talking about Trey. Similar approach. We're not talking about yesterday, we're talking about today. Yesterday is over and done with. It's gone. If you're following number 1 where you confront your problems, number 3 should be easy. And that brings us to number 4. Use I statements, not you statements. I'll give you an example. I really don't like it when the dishwasher doesn't get unloaded, as opposed to, you didn't unload the dishwasher again. See the difference? Makes a big difference. Take responsibility for your feelings because you're the one feeling them. What that allows is for the other person that you're having a conflict with, they can hear without getting defensive. Because I promise, somebody just got upset that I just told them they didn't unload the dishwasher right now. Number 5, stop exaggerating. Remove the words always and never from your vocabulary. Because I promise your husband has not always thrown his clothes on the floor and left them there. One time he threw them on the bed and left them there. You see what I'm saying? Universal statements are almost never true. So get rid of them. They just don't have any place. 6, avoid character assassination. I've talked to spouses who are like this, but I just don't understand how as spouses who love each other, we can just find ourselves calling each other names and just being generally nasty to one another. I mean, probably time for a timeout if that's the case. And I'm willing to bet or even wager on that if you are the one doing the name calling, you're probably actually wrong. If you don't have anything nice to say, just don't say anything. Because trust me, in about 10 minutes, you're going to regret everything you just said because now you got a whole new problem to deal with. 7, use appropriate words and actions. You probably heard this as, pick your battles. Some things just aren't worth fighting about. When Julie and I first got married, I was determined I was going to teach her the right way to load a dishwasher. 5 years later, I'm just glad the dishwasher got loaded and ran. It's like, at some point I decided, does it really matter as long as the dishes get clean? But we all have dumb things that we fight about like that. And the other part of that is there's almost nothing that's worth fighting about at max volume. That category is very small. For me, I put it in context because I'm a very hot fighter. That's just the way I yell, I get loud. I know you guys are surprised that I might be loud. That's shocking to everybody. But I just think, Kate's only 9 months, but she's going to look at Julie and I, and she's going to judge relationships on the way that we interact with one another. And so I think to myself, do I want a guy speaking to my daughter that way? No, he would once, because then I'd punch his teeth out, right? And so I'm like, if that's my standard for my child, then why is my standard for myself and my wife any different there? Use appropriate volume and words and action. This is probably my favorite one. I actually taught this to the students a few years ago. Some of them may remember. Win the relationship, not the argument. Some of us are so concerned with the scoreboard. Guess what? Nobody else can see the scoreboard. That's hard for me because I like to be right. Like if you spent any time with me, I like to be right. And I like to debate and I like to argue. Sometimes I'll pick arguments with Julie just for the heck of arguing. She hates that, by the way. But ultimately, I had to decide that the scoreboard was less important than until death do us part. I could win and be miserable, or we could compromise and be happy. Number 9, limits. Learn where the limits are. Learn when you need to take a time out. Julie and I actually have phrases we're not allowed to say to one another when we're arguing. I'm never allowed to say, fine, be that way. That's a trigger for her. She gets mad, so she goes and gets in the shower. No, I'm just kidding. And mine, I think it's because I work with teenagers every day, is whatever. You cannot say, do not say whatever to me while we're having a serious I will lose it. So we know, those are off limits. We don't use those phrases. It's a good thing. So if you know that you have a trigger, you should tell your spouse when you're not already fighting. Like, wait, tell them, hey, don't use this phrase because, you know. As the spouse who's told that, don't be a jerk and use it just because. Number 10, this is probably the biggest one, forgive. We're all going to screw up. We're all going to mess up. We're all going to need it. As a Christian, we're told, forgive as much as you have been forgiven. Some of us need to put Elsa on repeat in our car and just let it play. Let it go over and over and over. Whatever it takes, learn to forgive. Whether that be action or reaction, you have to learn. Now, a good message on conflict wouldn't really be complete without talking and taking just a couple minutes to say, what are some things maybe I can do long term? Right? We talked about 4 things you can do on a regular basis, but some things you can internalize to help maybe prevent some conflict. And that's going to be your third point this morning. How do we future-proof our relationships? Again, like I said, lists. So I've got another list for you. So I'm going to move quickly through these. Number 1, choose to accept your mate. For some reason, we forget, A, that God made each of us unique and in his image. And B, we were worth dying for on the cross. All of us. That's a lot of value. And guys, your wife was made from you. So everything you don't like about her probably came from you anyway. But seriously, cherish each other. We seem to forget sometimes that the other person we're talking with is human. They're a real person. They feel things too. God loves them as much as they love you. So let's make sure we keep in context. God loves and cherishes them, and we're called to do the same. Right out of that, your spouse is valuable. Romans 8:28-30 tells you God's using them to grow and mature you. You know why they get on your nerves so much? Because they're the exact opposite of you. So God's using them to help you with all your weaknesses. That's the whole thing, growing to look more like Christ. 3, we've already hit this one a little bit. Accept personal responsibility. Proverbs 15:32. Just own where you messed up. Like, this goes all the way back to the beginning, right? Let's imagine for a second we're in the Garden of Eden and Adam and Eve have eaten the fruit, whatever fruit you prefer to think of it as. God comes walking up and he says, what's going on? Adam says, we ate the fruit, you told me not to, and it's my fault because I was supposed to be in charge. All of history is completely different, right? But what does Adam actually say? She did it. All the way back to the first sin, we have been trying to put the responsibility for where we messed up on other people. Can you imagine a culture where people would just say, you know what, I messed that up? Man, America would be way different. The church would be way different. Learn to simply say, that's my fault, good and bad. Own it. 4, rejoice in and value your differences. I think we talked about this a little bit. Different, not wrong. Julie's the exact opposite of me. We've talked before, she's artistic. I draw fat stick people, right? Like as far away as you can get. But what I have come to appreciate about that the most is that she's able to see things completely different than I see them. I look at something and I'm like, I wouldn't be bothered by that at all. And Julie's like, lots of people are going to be offended by that. You can't say that. Like things like that. You know, she offers a completely different perspective. Value the differences. They're what make you complete as a couple. Number 5, communicate in a godly manner. Proverbs 4. If we could learn, we talked about this a little bit in the message on pursuing your spouse. Learn to tell our spouse what God says about them. Sometimes in spite of what we think about them in that moment, it would make a big difference. It would make them feel valued. It would make them feel loved. Number 6, stop assuming. Proverbs 18:13. How many of you guys have been fighting for a while and then realize you're fighting over nothing because you made an assumption and it wasn't actually true? Yeah, you don't have to raise your hand, but I feel like everybody at some point has been there. Right? You assume that this person knows. You assume this person didn't know. We assume tons of things, and they don't ever do anything but cause problems. Stop assuming. Ask for clarification. Over-communicate. It'll cure up a lot of headaches. Number 7, be an encourager. I like to boil this down to just be nice to each other. Like we all know people that don't ever say anything nice to anyone. Don't be that person, especially to your spouse. You think something nice about them, say it. When you think something not nice about them, don't say it. It's just a good rule of thumb. Be real and be honest. Guys, say when something hurts your feelings. We seem to struggle with that. But the most important thing I think here, 2 words, they're like one of the 2 most powerful words in the English language. I'm sorry. Like if you're in the middle of an argument and you say the words I'm sorry, the tone goes from here to here really quickly. Learn to say I'm sorry. It'll make a big difference. Number 9, accept yourself in Jesus. Now this one's kind of strange because it deals more with ourselves and our spirit and that kind of thing. But what I find is most people either don't know or don't believe what God says about them to be true. That creates a big problem because what it does is it either gives you an inferiority or a superiority complex. So what does that mean? If you have an inferiority complex, you're constantly trying to put other people down to make yourself feel better. If you have a superiority complex, you're constantly putting people down so you can make sure they know that they're beneath you. There's no room for that in marriages. And that will cause a lot of grief, a lot of heartache, and a lot of conflict. You have to know that God says you are His creation, you are loved, you are valuable, and He died for you. And guess what? He says the same thing about your spouse. Everybody is on equal level. And Paul says there is no Jew, there's no Gentile, there's everybody. It's all equal playing field. Stop viewing yourself as better than or worse than other people. Believe what Jesus says about you. And number 10, be a lover. Again, we talked about this in week 2. Learn to speak your spouse's love language and then speak it often. Sometimes just simply letting them know that they are loved can make a big difference. Now, in the last couple minutes we've got, I just want to hit one thing through this passage. We haven't really mentioned it, but Solomon here is actually a good depiction of Jesus. And this is important because through this series we've been talking about, hey, if your marriage is healthy, it's going to reflect the gospel. It's going to tell people about the love that God has for them. And you're like, maybe you're like, I don't really see it. Well, we're going to see it right here. And you probably didn't catch it because it's a little bit subtle, but Solomon is standing at the door knocking, right? Wanting to get in his own house. Now, Solomon is the what of Israel? It's not a trick question. King, right? So, good job, Blake. So, I don't know if you know a whole lot about kings. Kings don't knock and ask and beg very often. They have all the power. They command. They control all the justice. They control all the punishment. And yet here's Solomon, the king of Israel, standing at the door to where his wife is, and he's simply knocking and asking to come in. It's this picture that we see in Revelation 3:20 where it says, behold, I stand at the door and knock, and if anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come into him and eat with him and he with me. Jesus is talking here, and it's the same picture. Solomon isn't simply demonstrating the proper attitude with which to approach conflict and handle conflict in marriage. He's foreshadowing Jesus Christ and the church. Right? Because between us and our Creator, there's a physical and a spiritual barrier that prevents us from reconciling that relationship. Just like there was a physical barrier of a door between Solomon and his wife, preventing them from reconciling their relationship. And just like Solomon, Jesus is standing and he's knocking and he's saying, I'm giving you the opportunity to open the door to restore a broken relationship. For Solomon, it was with his wife. For us, it's with God, our Creator. I have all the power in the world. I have all the right to judge and punish you, and yet here is an opportunity. I am restraining my power and offering you grace. After all, if you read, his wife says, even my spirit has failed me. But now I desire to be with my love. It's simply an opportunity that's being presented on a regular, consistent basis. An invitation from Jesus into salvation. This is important because this is how our marriages can demonstrate the gospel and salvation to the world. Because no greater opportunity exists than when we are in the middle of a conflict with our spouse to offer grace and forgiveness and to reconcile that relationship instead of continuing to punish and fight and argue and allow that expanse to get bigger and bigger. We decide in the middle of our conflict, in the middle of our sin, that we are going to offer one another grace as opposed to judgment. That's how healthy marriages speak the message of salvation to the world. Because what it does is ultimately it decides no matter what conflict is between us, no matter what problem there is, it's not too much for grace. Grace that is fueled by love. And isn't that exactly what Easter taught us? No matter what's between us, I will come to you and restore that relationship. I will provide the opportunity to make it right. So this isn't just about having better marriages. This isn't just about being friends or fighting less. Because ultimately, when you do these things, it allows the world to see Jesus through your marriage. Let's pray.